Turn around, put your hands behind your back. Right now, you're being placed under arrest for operating while intoxicated, okay?
I'm not intoxicated. Dude, I'm not intoxicated. I blew zero.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to Southern Draw Law. My name is James White, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, former police officer. Today, I want to talk to you guys about DUI traffic stops. So what prompted this conversation is that I was at the pharmacy yesterday, and the lady that was helping me check out, so I live in a fairly small community in East Tennessee, and she recognized me from the prosecutor's office, and she knew a couple people in common, and we got to talking. And I have recently left the prosecutor's office, so I'm not a prosecutor anymore, but we started talking, and she said, yeah, I really had to lean on that office in 2016. And so while I'm listening to her talk, I thought, well, that's really nice that, you know, it's been 7 years or 8 years and it's present enough in her mind to suggest that the prosecutor's office was helpful. And then she starts to explain to me that on some morning in 2016, she was a manager at the Dollar General, and she had pulled up to work, and she was the opening manager, so the store was not open at the time that she pulled up. And for whatever reason, she dropped stuff in the floor. She took like an extraordinary amount of time to get her stuff together and get out of the car. Well, in the meantime, from the time that she pulled up until the time that she got her stuff together and was getting ready to go in and open the store, a police officer who had been sitting across the street comes up behind her vehicle, and it's parked, and he turns on his lights and asks her to step out and basically conducts a traffic stop. So I realized in the moment that the story that she's telling me about her victimhood isn't the same sort of victimhood that I was thinking when she started telling the story, because actually she got victimized by the police department. And she was a victim of a malicious prosecution or a false arrest, not being, you know, victimized by a criminal. And so she starts telling me the story, and she basically tells me that the officer had asked her why she had been sitting there for so long, and she explained to him that she worked there. And the officer said that he saw her eyes and that her eyes looked glassy, and he asked her if she would step out of the car, and so she did, and she complied. And he had her go through field sobriety tests, and she said, I just had my hip replaced. This lady's like in her 60s, and my balance was not good. And she's like, I couldn't do any of his tests. And she's like, I failed every one of his tests. And he asked me if I had any medication that I took. And she said, yeah, I take alprazolam, which is a anti-anxiety or an anti-seizure medication. Some doctors use it for different things, but it's most commonly prescribed for anxiety. And she said, I do take that. I take it at night to sleep, but I haven't taken it in 2 days. Well, the officer, unsatisfied with her performance on the field sobriety test, ends up arresting her. She said, they took me over to the hospital and drew my blood. It took forever, and they arrested me, and I had to go to jail, and I had to sit in jail for almost a day, and it took forever for the blood results to come back. It was 8 or 9 months later that the blood results came back from the lab and showing that I didn't have anything in my system. And she goes, and that judge was just so sweet, and he said, Mrs. whatever her name is, you're free to go. And I thought, well, a couple different things that I thought. First and foremost, this lady's not bitter. And so I guess my daily ambition is to become a good enough person that when somebody perpetrates an injustice upon me the way that this lady had it done to her, that I'll be the type of person who can forgive and grant grace that easily. But I can promise you that's not me today. So she didn't seem to hold any grudge or any ill will or hard feelings. In fact, she credited the prosecutor's office with helping her. The second takeaway that I had from that is a lot of just normal people who think that the police are there to help you all the time have no idea what they can and can't do, what are their responsibilities, what they can be ordered to do in the process of a investigation. So I thought, you know what, it'd be a great time to talk about that and go through the appropriate way to handle a DUI investigation if you're stopped. First of all, let's kind of look at how DUIs work. So basically, DUIs and uniform laws across the nation are a result of the federal government controlling the purse strings for highway safety money. So basically, the federal government comes in and says, look, we have these millions of dollars that we will give you to improve roads and improve the functionality of highways and highway systems, and the only thing you have to do in order to get that money is that you have to adopt uniform legislation as it relates to impaired driving. And so most states, almost every state, has the 0.08 blood alcohol concentration. Now a lot of that's changed because many of the DUIs are not alcohol related, they're drug related, and of course so the 0.08 doesn't necessarily do what I think the government intended or wanted for it to do in the process of setting that as a standard. But that's why you have a 0.08 blood alcohol concentration, because the states want access to those millions millions of dollars. Two, as part of that, almost every state, or every state probably, has what's called an implied consent. And implied consent is a contract that you agree to when you get your driver's license, and you became privileged enough to pay them money for a plastic card with all your information on it. You signed a form, and it's called implied consent. And what implied consent is, that you're basically agreeing up front when you take this license that if you are ever asked to submit a sample of your blood or breath by a police officer, that you will do so. And if you don't do so, then you will lose your driving privileges for various amounts of time. But first offense, it's usually a year. Well, what people don't know, so people think that means that anytime a police officer asks you for blood or breath, that you have to give it to them. But that's not actually how it works. What people don't know is that implied consent doesn't get triggered in most cases until the officer has developed probable cause of impairment. And so it's true that if an officer has developed probable cause of an impairment and arrests a person based on that probable cause, that if that person refuses to give their blood or breath under those circumstances, that their license will be suspended. So you have to give your blood or breath once an officer has developed probable cause. What you don't have to do is help the officer develop probable cause, and that's where people get confused. Because again, my last video was about Pennsylvania versus Mims, and we know that in Pennsylvania versus Mims, just about any time a police officer asks you to step out of the vehicle, that's going to be considered a lawful command, so long as in the process of the telling of the story, the officer has enough awareness about the Constitution to leverage his request to get out of the car against some factor related to officer safety. But what you don't have to do is you don't have to participate in any of their field sobriety tests. And so if an officer asked me to step out of the car, and I alluded to it in my last video, the first thing I would do is I would comply after I put up some resistance, and if that failed, then I would comply with the order, and I would get out of the car and I would walk to the closest available guardrail, curb, whatever, where I could find some stability, and I would sit down. And more than likely what would happen is the officer would order me to stand up, and I would decline, and I would say, no, I'm not participating in any of your field sobriety tests, I'm not participating in any tests that you want to offer me, and I'm not going to answer any questions. So if you feel like you need to arrest me, you can arrest me, but I'm not going to participate in your investigation. And what would happen is the officer would very likely arrest me. And so just understand that if you undertake this route, you're probably going to get arrested. But here's what is good for people in the situation that I just described. The way that the officer develops probable cause is that they start with reasonable suspicion. You stop somebody for a traffic violation, and you might have probable cause for the traffic violation, or you might have reasonable suspicion for a civil infraction like a seatbelt or something like that, or a tent violation, but you don't have probable cause of anything else. And so the officer has to basically start investigating the traffic infraction and then develop reasonable suspicion of impairment from his interaction with the driver. And so basically the way that happens is the officer says, well, I smelled an odor of alcohol in their breath, or their speech was slurred. But again, you have to keep in mind that the officer doesn't know what your normal speech pattern is. And so what he might consider to be slurred might be because you had a stroke and that's the way you talk. You know, he's like, okay, well, now I have reasonable suspicion that they're impaired. I'm going to ask him to step out and perform some field sobriety tests. I've had clients where the officer's like, well, raise your sunglasses for me, and they do it. Don't do that. Why would you let an officer view your eyes if they can't see them through your sunglasses? And then you don't have an obligation to. That is self-incrimination. If your eyes are glassy, or even if the officer is going to look at your eyes or make the accusation that your eyes are glassy, you don't have to do that. There's a protective lens between you and the officer's vision. That means that in order to see your eyes, the officer either has to get you to consent to raising your glasses, which gives him a right to look, or he has to force them up, which that means that he's looking at your eyes through an illegal vantage point, which means that anything he sees is going to be suppressed. So you don't have to raise your glasses up. You don't have to talk and say sentences. You don't have to say anything. That's what the Fifth Amendment is about. You can just decline. And so what happens is that officer never develops probable cause. Now, again, they're going to arrest you, but the arrest is going to be based on something less than probable cause. Well, so why do you go sit down on the curb, you might ask? Well, I go sit down on the curb because I'm not going to stand there because I've got, like in the case of the lady that I just referred to, a recent hip replacement and my balance is off. So I'm not going to stand there and sway back and forth so the officer can say that one of the clues that he observed is that I was unsteady on my feet. I'm not going to lift my sunglasses up so he can say that I had glassy eyes. And I'm not going to engage in a bunch of conversations so he can say that he smelled the odor of alcohol on my breath. Those are all things that take reasonable suspicion to probable cause. And so if you don't participate in that and you don't play the probable cause game, you'll never get there. Now, you probably will get arrested, but that's a false arrest. It's not something that you will get convicted of very likely because the officer will have no evidence. So in where you don't have a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08 or above, what you have to prove as a police officer in most states is that this person was in such a condition that they couldn't safely operate a motor vehicle on a public roadway. And so when you go to prove the probable cause of the case, if all you have is this person handed me their driver's license, they complied with my order, and then they sat down and they didn't take any of my tests, well, what evidence are you going to use to get from reasonable suspicion to proof beyond a reasonable doubt? The answer is you're not. And implied consent doesn't just trigger simply because an officer makes an arrest. When the process of this arrest plays out in court, it's very likely that there's not going to be a probable cause finding because the officer wasn't able to get any evidence from you to raise that from a reasonable suspicion to a probable cause. And so because of that, you're not going to be found guilty of the implied consent violation because under the totality of the circumstance, the only thing the officer had was what might have been unreasonable or reasonable articulable suspicion, but he never developed probable cause, which is the level that he has to bring the case to in order to trigger your responsibility to give your blood or breath. So I would refuse blood or breath, and I would refuse to participate in any field sobriety tests. And ultimately, you are going to spend some money. You're going to have to hire a lawyer, or maybe you're indigent and you get represented by the public defender, but it's going to take up a year of your life while you wait on the court process to play out. But ultimately, you're going to have a case where the officer doesn't have probable cause to even be able to take you to trial, and that case is very likely going to get dismissed. Now, it is going to be a hardship on you, but I can tell you this, probably 70-80% of the time that people participate, even if they're not drunk, they're going to get arrested anyway, because as we've discussed in previous videos, it's very difficult to dispel an officer's suspicion, and so you're better off just not doing it and not giving them any evidence to work with at all. Then once the charges were dismissed for lack of probable cause, then you would have an opportunity to sue for false arrest if you wanted to. But one of the elements of malicious prosecution, and in some states or in the federal courts, false arrest, is that there can't be a substantiated criminal charge. And so that's why a lot of times lawsuits take a really long time, because you have to wait for the criminal charges to get dismissed before you can really proceed in hopes of winning. Because if you've been convicted of the thing that they arrested you, you're not going to be able to allege that it was a false arrest. Never, ever, 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 ever do field sobriety tests. You are not obligated to do that. And the courts have held that holding someone on the side of the road for the purposes of doing field sobriety tests do not trigger a Miranda warning. So it's not a violation. You're not in custody under Miranda. And so an officer doesn't have to read you a Miranda warning to ask you to do field sobriety tests. What nobody talks about is that it's voluntary. You don't have to do it. And so the reason that matters is because, and just like this lady is a perfect example of this, people give the police and the criminal justice process so much credibility. They believe that if you're in the criminal justice process and the police brought you in and introduced you to the courts, that there's a very good likelihood that you're guilty. And so you have a thing called jury nullification, where the jury has so much faith in what they feel about the defendant or what they feel about the government that they ignore whether or not that standard has been met under the law. And so people talk all the time about how it's difficult because the state has the burden, but the truth of the matter is it's true that the state has the burden of proving a case beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's true that numerically speaking that's above 95% probability that you did the thing. But what they don't talk about is the fact that in order to get to a jury, you have to go through the preliminary stages. So there's very likely going to be a preliminary hearing in a lower court, and then you're going to get to the probable cause stage where the judge binds it over, and then that goes before a grand jury, and then the judge, that's the trial judge, is going to hear hopefully motions that your defense lawyer filed on your behalf in order to try to get the case dismissed. And if the case survives that, then it goes to the jury. And so by the time a jury gets involved, they're looking across the aisle at this defendant and taking nothing else other than the number of layers this thing has gone through in order to find its way in front of them. You're 80% there. They believe that the state has brought you there justly and that they're legitimate in their accusation against you. And so it is true that the state has the burden, but I mean, what nobody talks about is that they're 80% there by the time the trial starts. And so, and I'll do another video on the grand jury process, but you can indict a ham sandwich. A grand jury testimony is nothing more than a police officer being in the grand jury room reading his version of events. Just most of the time it's reading a narrative that is identical to the warrant that he wrote or the charging document that he submitted to the court. And so there are very few questions that the grand jury asks or gets to ask, but the defendant doesn't have a right in most states to be at the grand jury. And so it's all the state gets to say whatever they want and nobody there to challenge them. So the joke is you can indict a ham sandwich. And again, I'm going to I'm going to do a video on that, going in depth about the grand jury process at some point. But I just really feel like this is information that needs to be out there. A lot of people just don't realize that you can refuse an officer's request to do field sobriety. It is a consensual interaction with the police officer for them to request that you do field sobriety tests. So always refuse. There's no reason whatsoever for you to take a chance on some officer being conscientious enough to say, oh, I'm not going to arrest this person because I don't believe they're impaired. And on the flip side of it, when I was a police officer, I will tell you, I've experienced this myself. When I was a police officer, I actually stopped a 4th year or 3rd year medical resident, and I could smell alcohol in his breath. I asked him if he'd had anything to drink. He said he'd had 2 glasses of wine at dinner, and then I got him out of the car. He was a surgical resident, so, you know, would think fairly coordinated person. I got him out of the car, and he had nystagmus, so the eyes bouncing at a maximum deviation. He had nystagmus, which was, based on my training, consistent with impairment, and he failed the 1-leg stand and he failed the walk and turn. He didn't, I don't remember what the clues are, because this was, 2003, 2004. But I arrested this guy for DUI, and I got him over to the station, and his issue was alcohol, and he blew on the intoxilizer and blew a .02. And so I was a conscientious police officer, and I went directly to the magistrate before the guy even got booked into the jail. I took the complaint over to the magistrate, took the defendant over to the magistrate, and I said, I'd like to dismiss this case. He blew a .02. I don't see any sense in proceeding with prosecution. He wasn't impaired, and I don't want to ruin his medical career. He's a doctor. So I want to dismiss this before it becomes a thing. And I did that, and I saw him several years later, and he was a thriving medical doctor. But you don't want to take a chance on a police officer being conscientious enough to stand in front of the judge and say, hey, look, I got this wrong. Because more times than not, that's not going to happen. I hope you guys get some value out of this content, and please remember to like and subscribe. My goal is to get the channel to 100,000 subscribers by the end of 2024. And so we're basically starting from the ground level. So please like and subscribe. Please comment that you subscribed in the comment section. I'll try to reply to all the comments. I'd love to interact with you. And so, if you find value, give me some suggestions. Comment some suggestions of videos you'd like to see, and I'd be happy to do them. I don't know what you guys want to learn and where you're at and what your journey is, but happy to do it and happy to interact with you. So if you want to look at some other topics, I've got several other videos and legal topics and police interactions and that kind of thing on my channel. So go to one of those other videos, and hope you find some value there too. Thanks a bunch.